So, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Richard Jacobi, currently the minister at the East London and Essex Liberal Synagogue, having been ordained and working there since 2008 when I was ordained. And it's my pleasure to be co-presenting this with Rabbi Pete Tobias.
Who happens to be me, so I'd better introduce myself. So, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, if indeed anybody did. I'm Rabbi Peter Tobias. I am now at my second manifestation as the Rabbi of the Glasgow Reform Synagogue up here in the frozen north. I've been here for my second time since September 2021. I was previously here between 1995 and 2003.
So, our plan for this evening is to hear a little bit from you in chat at the moment about some of the features or attributes of the God that you definitely do not believe in.
The whole idea of the God you don't believe in was actually the opening chapter of a book that I wrote about 5 years ago now, called "Putting the O in God." And the God you don't believe in, to me, is always written as G-D. That there's this God that somehow you're not allowed to say this God's name, and that this God from whom we have detached ourselves by not allowing ourselves to say the name has these various characteristics that are just completely, well, ridiculous is the word that comes to mind, because it's not how anyone, I would imagine, would conceive of God. And I often find myself being asked by people saying, "Oh, I don't really believe in God." And my first question to them is, "Well, can you tell me about the God you don't believe in?" And it turns out to be the kind of God who's doing all the things, or supposedly or purportedly does all the things that you're listing in the chat right now. Okay, so here we are. The G-D you don't believe in. So at various points during this evening's conversation, I hope we're going to try and draw a distinction between G-D, who is the sort of the manifestation of the divine that I think many of us grew up with, certainly me in an Orthodox environment where you're not allowed to write the name or say that name in any way, shape, or form. And we'll spend more time on that. And a G-O-D, which is perhaps something that we'd like to be a little bit closer to. So the God you don't believe in is a God who controls weather in order to punish people, who hears and responds to human prayer, and regardless of what those prayers might be or how improbable the requests might be, and who can heal illnesses miraculously. Now, Richard, I don't know if you've got an eye on the chat. If you want to quote any other of the comments that have been made there, I know you can probably all see them. I'll just have a look myself. There's 24.
Absolutely. We had conversation about the God not being split into several beings, but we also had the vengeful God. And I can remember an RE coordinator for a London borough talking about the difference between the Jewish God and the Christian God was that the Christian God was a God of love and the Jewish God was a dark and vengeful God. We complained about this particular RE coordinator. Um, Someone certainly said about God being, Janet, I might have known it would be you, omnibenevolent. Uh,
Nice.
and we wouldn't agree with that. Norman, thank you for naming our Father, our King, the bearded old man on high, which we nearly added as another of those lightning bolts. So those sorts of answers and the others that you've given us, I think, are great examples of the God we don't believe in.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. Well, Helen's asked, why are we still using this troublesome word God? Asks Helen. Well, the answer is we haven't got another one at the moment. Maybe we'll have come up with something by the end of this evening, but let's see how we go. So I'm going to tell just a little anecdote, which is one of my favorite anecdotes in such a context about people's attitudes towards God, a little story. And the story was about Mrs. Cohen, a lady called Mrs. Cohen, who goes to shul every week, sits at the back of the shul, and it comes to the silent section at the end of the Amidah. And Mrs. Cohen, in the silence, whispers quietly in her conversation with God and says, "God, please let me win the lottery." And off she goes. The service ends. She comes back the next week. She's in the same seat again. And it comes to that same point of the prayer. And she says, "Maybe you weren't listening last week, God, but please, can you let me win the lottery?" Uh, Another week passes and she's back in shul again the following Shabbat. And she's a bit more agitated now. She says, "Look, I've asked you twice now. Please, God, will you let me win the lottery?" Nothing happens, and the whole thing goes on and on, week after week after week. And eventually, after about 10 weeks, it gets to the point of the Amidah, and instead of whispering quietly in her silent prayer, she decides the only thing to do is to yell out. So she stands up and says, "God, I've been asking you for weeks now. Please, will you let me win the lottery?" And God takes time off from ordering the universe and doing all those things that God is meant to do and says, "Mrs. Cohen, do me a favor, meet me halfway. Buy a ticket." So I put that there as a way of thinking, and come back to the ticket in a moment. But unreasonable expectations of how we expect God to behave is what I think we'd like to focus on initially this evening. So there are various thinkers through the ages after the rabbis finished doing their thing, who came up with various ideas of what God might be. And here is Moses Maimonides, and I shall hand over to Richard to take us through his 13 principles.
So many of you will be aware of Maimonides, one of the greatest thinkers. People have said very famously, from Moses till Moses, there arose none like Moses. So Maimonides' influence was not to be underestimated. And he developed these 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith. As we run through the list of 13, give yourself a point if you believe it. Give yourself half a point if you're maybe, I'm not sure. And obviously don't give yourself a point if you don't believe it. Maimonides begins with the idea that the belief in the existence of the Creator, who is perfect in every manner of existence and is the primary cause of all that exists. It's a great philosophical statement that God is the prime cause, that without God, the universe would not have come into an existence. So that's number one. Give yourself a point or not, as the case may be. Then there is the belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity, that God is one. You could, if you like, reference the Shema in that line. The belief in God's non-corporeality. In other words, God is not embodied in any way at all, and God will not be affected by any physical occurrences such as movement or rest or dwelling, any of those sorts of things. So God is not embodied in any way. That's number three. Again, think about whether you want to give yourself a point or a half point. The belief in God's eternity. The imperative to worship God exclusively and no foreign false gods. So Maimonides there is wording the first two of the Ten Commandments. Number six, the belief that God communicates with humanity, we might say in our modern parlance, through prophecy. Number seven, the belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, our teacher. In other words, Moses has an elevated status over anyone else. Number eight, the belief in the divine origin of the Torah, that either the Torah is God-given or God written, not the thinking of human beings. The belief in the immutability of the Torah. In other words, everything in the Torah is correct. So, Susan, if you've got some are you don't know, you may want to give half points for those to come up with your final score. So we had the immutability of the Torah, the belief in God's omniscience, seeing everything, and God's providence. God will provide what is needed, and God is inherently good in that sense. The belief in divine reward and retribution. So ultimately, in some way, shape, or form, people will be rewarded or punished for what they do. The belief in the arrival of the Messiah at some point, unnamed, unspecified, and the Messianic era when everything will be blissful, like the Garden of Eden was before anyone ate of the fruit. And the 13th is the belief in resurrection of the dead.
Okay, we've got a couple of tens, a seven, a five, a two and a half. Gosh, that's six and a half, zero. That's impressive. Okay,
Okay.
not oh, there's a 13 in there somewhere. That's interesting. We'll come back to that, but somebody had 12. So we've got a few people who are buying into all of those. But most people are fairly
It's middling.
two and a half, says Josie. I'm not sure if you're still Jewish. Don't worry, you don't have to stick to Maimonides' words to prove your Jewish status. It's fine. That's not what this is about.
Maimonides set the pattern for a few centuries after him. And what disrupted that pattern of theological thinking was the Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment period brought knowledge that some Jewish people, particularly in Western Europe, sought to introduce into Judaism. And so what gradually happened was a debate began to emerge between those who were buying into, particularly after Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution, were buying into those sorts of ideas and other scientific approaches, as well as developments in some of the art side of um, evolving ologies. The split became those who believed in one revelation that happened in Sinai only, and the idea of progressive revelation, revelation occurring as human beings understand more of what God requires of us, then we understand how we should be behaving more. We've put unreconstructed Judaism there because we feel that's a suitably unflattering adjective for what tends to be known as Orthodox Judaism. And of course, in a country like ours, if something has a claim to the Orthodox position to be the established position, then it has greater power than something that argues it's progressive. And that's a battle we're still fighting to this day, and is one of the arguments in favor of the coming together into a single movement so we can fight that battle better rather than argue between us. So, what the thinking is that we need to consider how progressive revelation allows for an understanding that says God did not write the Torah. The Torah was the understanding of people at the time. As our knowledge accumulates and grows, so our understanding of God, what God wants from us grows. And in one particular area that we're going to touch on as we develop this presentation, for example, the role of women and the place of women in Judaism is an aspect of, if you're in unreconstructed Judaism, then the role of men as central and the role of women as peripheral is different to as we evolve progressively. And that there are many other aspects of that in terms of the way progressive Judaism differs from unreconstructed Judaism. Take us through some of those. Pete's going to look at some of the different wordings and platforms that were set out for progressive Judaism.
So thank you, Richard. So progressive Judaism, as we know it, began really in Germany, but it was in America that it found its really clear formulation towards the end of the 19th century. And the first of these sets of statements was the Pittsburgh Platform, which was produced by the American rabbis in 1885. And it began with this statement: "We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite, and in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man." This is 19th century, so my apologies for the language. "We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers, in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended, amidst continual struggles and trials, and under enforced isolation, this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race. So it's quite a grandiose statement being made in Pittsburgh there by the rabbis in America. But clearly, we're talking about what I love to hear, the God idea. So, in other words, we're talking about a concept rather than an actual being, which is very much the focus of some of the other aspects of Judaism at the time. This was an incredibly radical platform in the level of things that it rejected, more to do with ideas of Jewish practice. It rejected all of Moses' revelation, and it said that, the Judaism that we're going to formulate in America, in our modern world, is the kind of Judaism that we need. But this is the specific focus on God. And 1937, I'm trying to do the maths, but it's defeating me. 52 years later, the Columbus platform came out. And this was what it had to say on the same subject, its opening statements. The nature of Judaism, it said, Judaism is the historical religious experience of the Jewish people. Though growing out of Jewish life, its message is universal, aiming at the union and perfection of mankind under the sovereignty of God. Reform Judaism recognizes the principle of progressive development in religion and consciously applies this principle to spiritual as well as to cultural and social life. Judaism welcomes all truth, whether written in the pages of scripture or deciphered from the records of nature. The new discoveries of science, while replacing older scientific views underlying our sacred literature, do not conflict with the essential spirit of religion as manifested in the consecration of man's will, heart, and mind to the service of God and of humanity. And then the second of their statements about God, the heart of Judaism and its chief contribution to religion is the doctrine of the one living God who rules the world through law and love. In him, all existence has its creative source, and mankind its ideal of conduct. Though transcending time and space, he is the indwelling presence of the world. We worship him as the Lord of the universe and our merciful Father. Again, some of the language there sits rather uncomfortably with us in our day and age now, with our change of language use. But the principles are still similar to those in the Pittsburgh platform. It wasn't quite as dismissive of Jewish tradition and traditional Jewish practice as was the Pittsburgh one that preceded it. But the idea of God being an idea rather than an actual persona, although much more so in this set of statements, is still very much there. And then a couple of other statements that emerged as time passed. So Leo Beck, who, as I'm sure many of you know, emerged from the Holocaust and who came to the UK after the war, and shortly after his death, this statement appeared in a book that was specifically written for RSGB, for the Reform movement. There is only one reality, he says, the one God, one commandment and the doing of it, that only one knowledge and one trust are of any avail, the knowledge of the one God and trust in that God, and that only one decision and one life are set before humanity, the decision regarding the one and life in the one. This principle, he said, is often succinctly called ethical monotheism. And ethical monotheism is something that we're going to return to as a basis for how we help us define and give ourselves an understanding of God here in our rather confused 21st century. And then just over 30 years ago, the affirmations of liberal Judaism, probably modeled very much on those two earlier platforms from America. These were written by Rabbi Dr. John Rayner in 1992. And the introduction this little section from the introduction is worth including just to give us an idea. And of course, this is specifically for liberal Jews, but it obviously works, I'm sure, just as well with the adjective progressive in it. So to be a practicing, let's say it now, progressive Jew in the 21st century, and obviously this was rewritten sometime in the 21st century, not in 1992, is to believe that tradition should be transmitted within the framework of modern thinking and morality. It is to live according to the prophetic ideal of doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. And these are the first of the two of 42 affirmations. Judaism. We affirm our commitment to Judaism, the religious and cultural heritage of the Jewish people, and the centrality within that heritage of the Jewish religion, which, since the time of Abraham and Sarah, has proclaimed the sovereignty of the one God. And we affirm the Jewish conception of God. So again, it's a conception, one and indivisible, transcendent and immanent, creator and sustainer of the universe, source of the moral law, a God of justice and mercy, who demands that human beings shall practice justice and mercy in their dealings with each other. So that seems a fairly clear statement, and it echoes the earlier ones from the American platforms, but good to know that it's a British one. And from there, these are the various statements that have helped us through the last 150 years, shall we say, of the development of progressive Judaism, set against a background of all sorts of historical changes and scientific and technological developments, many of which may leave us feeling that God is even more distant from our world than was the case in the 19th century. So we ask ourselves the question, where are we now?
And perhaps to help elaborate on that question, here's a quote from a rabbi and teacher. Two contrasting facts stand out in the spiritual state of the modern world. One is the need for faith. The other is that there are greater difficulties than ever in the way of faith. Anyone want to have a guess when that was written? Is it contemporary? Is it older? What do you think? And technically, and from your perspective, is it something that feels true now? The answer is, so 1850, post-Holocaust, during World War II. We've got some responses in the chat. Thank you to those who gave them. It was written in 1937 by Rabbi Israel Mattock. And yet, when we found it and we looked at it, we thought, actually, it's as true now as it was then. And we may use slightly different language. I think there's less comfort with using the word faith than perhaps there was back in 1937. But we could substitute in meaning. We could substitute in spiritual calm, perhaps, or something like that. And we might find that we still have some idea of believing in that. But we also know that the difficulties in the way have grown since then. However, compared to the platforms and the documents that Pete talked you through just a few minutes ago, any theology that we are going to develop and articulate has to start from a few premises. And so as we move on to the next slide, we'll come to one of the most influential thinkers of feminist Judaism, Judith Plasko, who wrote in 1990 a real pivotal book in the evolution of Jewish thinking. And what Judith Plasko said was, when God is pictured as male in a community that understands man to have been created in God's image, it only makes sense that maleness functions as the norm of Jewish humanity. When maleness becomes normative, women are necessarily other, excluded from Torah, and subordinated in the community of Israel. And of course, if we look back just in the context of this session, the people who we have quoted individually or collectively thus far are all men. And another man, Rabbi Professor Lawrence Hoffman, Larry Hoffman, is credited by Rabbi Alexandra Wright and others as having invented the phrase the half-empty bookcase, that Judaism has, over the many centuries of written thinking, only populated the male half of the bookcase. It didn't populate the female half. And if progressive Judaism is to be and to succeed in truly making egalitarian Judaism happen in a day-to-day reality, then we have to work hard to balance this. I have never once had to correct people for using God and masculine pronouns in, for example, a bar or bat mitzvah students' Devar Torah for their bar or bat mitzvah. I've often had to say to just offer the gentle challenge. Do you really see God as male when you write down about what God wants of you in this passage or whatever? And it's only when people stop and think that sometimes they start to grapple with it. Now, until it's equally easy to refer to God by either pronoun or for all of us to avoid using gendered pronouns, we've still got a battle on our hands. Alex Wright then went on to write herself as she concluded an article in Hear Our Voice, a compilation of women rabbis' writings and preachings that was edited by Rabbi Sybil Sheridan in 1994, argues that feminist theology has opened up an entirely new dimension of spiritual creativity and thought. And one example she gave in that article was to think about the things we confess for on Yom Kippur. And if you take a look, if you've got your High Holiday prayer book, go back and look at them and ask yourself the question, how many of these things that we're saying sorry for actually come out of, if you like, a more masculine set of behaviors? And how many relate to feminine behaviors? And Alex argued quite convincingly in my terms that until we have a liturgy that balances the different ways in which different groups of people approach life, maybe we're not actually representing all the people who are seeking to understand and approach God. And so she said, when we add in a feminist theology or feminist approach to theology, then we can have a regenerative and renewing influence on Judaism. And above all, it will be a Judaism that honors completely the prophetic ideal of a broken society renewed and made whole through the vision and action of humanity in partnership with God. And so that's part of what our theology as progressive Judaism needs also to address. And so for a conclusion to our input, we'd like to take you through a few suggestions from Pete and myself to start the thinking about what a theology for progressive Judaism might include. And as Pete takes us into the first one, we want to say categorically, it's not an exhaustive list. It's just a starting point, and we would welcome your additions, particularly in questions or comments.
Thanks, Richard. So yes, we are clearly the idea, I think, that as the new movement of progressive Judaism emerges as some kind of a synthesis between liberal and reform Judaism with their respective histories, we're looking to develop some kind of a theology, a vision for what our understanding of our mission is as progressive Jews, what our theology is. And it's going to be something that hopefully most progressive Jews can support, but only few, knowing how Jews disagree with each other so readily, only few will actually love and sign up to 100%. So the chances of getting a consensus of what we think, how we perceive God among any number of Jews, even if there's only two of us in the room, we probably end up with three different opinions, as the cliche goes. So we're going to find something that not everybody is going to agree on, but a few broad principles, probably built around the ideas that we were playing with at the beginning, that the God we don't believe, and we can be quite clear of what we don't think our theology should entail. That might be easier than actually setting one up. We will set something up. Not everybody is going to buy into every aspect of it.
And so the second point comes back to what I just read about Alex Wright's article And we would want a theological statement for progressive Judaism to be having that kind of regenerative and renewing influence. I have to say, when I read the word regenerative, I do find myself thinking in terms of Doctor Who, but that sense that we can redevelop, we can regenerate, we can be the same but in a new form is something very powerful and is arguably the opportunity that the bringing together of the reform and liberal movements in this country will allow us to do, is to develop that sort of renewed and regenerative influence that is really going to give our Judaism a real pep and a lift as we pay heed to different perspectives on theology. And of course, theos, is the term from Greek for a masculine god, and theology is referencing a feminine or female god. Now, obviously, we're not saying that God is either of those things, but if we're willing to consider that what we're developing could equally be titled theology, for those who feel that is gives them a way into the discussion, then we should be open to doing that. And of course, there are other aspects of how we as people respond to these ideas that need to be reflected as well. There are certainly going to be some people who would want to ensure that any theology is worded in a way that reflects their sense of being part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so we want to find words that are inclusive and reflect to uh, everyone can find themselves reflected in the words we use, rather than using a set of language that only relates to one group of people.
I'm just going to read this and then I will elaborate. It might include the idea that we practice Godding, doing what is kind, good, and right. And that comes from we call this rigorous kind of this is a concept that actually emerged. I'm not claiming that it's unique, but I don't know if I invented the word, but in the book that I mentioned and that Simon put in the chat that was written a few years ago, the idea that I came up with that maybe God is a verb. Now, I thought that would be a good title for the book that I was writing at the time, but I discovered that there were at least three other books out there already with the same title, so that stole that idea from me. But the idea of God as a verb, in other words, that God is not something that we pray to or that we listen to or are commanded by, but it's something that we do. In other words, that the book, just to give it away, to give the ending away, it begins with the question putting the O in God with G-D, and we put the O back in God to make God more accessible to us, more approachable. But then you put another O in, and God becomes good. The idea that you actually do God, you do kindness, you do good deeds, and you do what's right. And we have, as Richard, as it says in this statement here, we've kind of building, Richard and I, and with the help of others as well, particularly Judith Rosenberry, are working on a concept that we're calling rigorous kindness, which is a kind of a manifestation of the ethical monotheism, that statement that Leo Beck made that we read about earlier, bringing God into the world as a form of goodness that we can make happen ourselves. And this, I think, is an integral part, or I hope will be an integral part of whatever our new theology is going to be.
And of course, being the diverse uh, group of Judaism that we are, and we saw that in some of the scores that we talked about earlier and we asked you for earlier, and some of the responses to the God that you don't believe in, including, of course, there are many Jews who simply reject the idea of God completely. And without going into the humanist Judaism that is a strand in America, our Judaism is going to be in the theist, because that is the history and the ethos of progressive Judaism. but it should also welcome those people who would define themselves beyond agnostic into the realms of atheist, because there's nothing in Judaism that actually says you have to believe in God. Even the Ten Commandments, nothing tells you believe in God. Ten Commandments simply say God's there. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt. Whether we buy that or not is entirely left to our discretion. And for the rabbis of the rabbinic period, they didn't have particularly any settled theology. And if you ask them what the core thing of Judaism was, the fundamental basic principle of Judaism was, most of the time they argued it was how we treat other people, typically Hillel. What is hateful to you, do not do to anyone else. All the rest is commentary. And so we would hope that whatever theological statement is made by the movement, it's not going to exclude those people who don't like it very much or disagree with it, because that's not the movement we are. Hopefully, that's a strand of our inclusion.
And another element of it, we hope, is that it will be much more assertive and comprehensive and less diffident than late 20th century liberal or reform Judaism. There was a period when we were kind of being very careful and not wanting to tread on toes or be seen as being in any way politically motivated. But the reality is that we are living in a world where there are many forces at play which are creating all sorts of havoc. And to simply stand on the side and just sort of shrug and say, well, because we have our liberal with a small L perspective on the world, we can't really come down on one side or another. We can't choose a particular side of an argument. It's not really acceptable when there's the level of poverty that exists in our country and in other countries in the world, where there's the level of racist ideologies that are being promoted in different countries all over the place. We have to be able to be much more firm in our statements of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and that is, I think, a very important element of what we hope our new theology will set out.
That point takes us to the last of our suggested bullet points for this evening, which is that any theological statement we're going to make is actually coming from people who affirm and assert our support for liberal democracy, liberal being the wider political, social ethos of liberalism and liberal democracy. And that's going to extend to our condemnation of all forms of authoritarianism, as we know that those tend to other groups, in terms of othering them, and also tends towards something that we Jews have been victim of too often in the past, and therefore we wouldn't wish to do that. And we'll start, Susan, with you, as you've raised a hand immediately.
I love the phrase God optional, which is used by Rabbi Michael Olavi in New York, because I spend my time, not all my time, but I and Rabbi Gilly actually spend a lot of time talking to people who say, oh, I can't possibly come to your synagogue because I don't believe in God. And we say, well, it's not a requirement. And they say, what do you mean it's not a requirement? And so, when I suggested we put that on our website, though, there were some people who were quite anxious about putting God optional on our website. So I think it'd be really nice if PJ would say something about God being optional.
Sounds good to me.
It's a lovely comment, and thanks for expressing it the way you did, Susan. Yeah, I think we'd go along with that. It is not essential that you have to have any sense of believing in God to fit into any of our communities, I would hope. Tony.
A rabbi or a reverend who would travel around to different communities. He was the rabbi for, can't remember his name, but he was.
I think you may be thinking about Reverend Malcolm Wiseman.
And he was told to, and he was asked by the humanist group to he said he could do what he liked and say what he liked as long as he didn't mention God.
Arguably, you could make a very clear Jewish statement without the need to reference God, because there's enough text that simply talks about how to be a good Jew, and it's how you go about behaving in the world. You don't need God.
I think you should judge a religion whether it's useful and good for people rather than not, rather than if it's true or not, because we don't know if it's going to be true.
It's interesting you've raised that point, Tony. Thank you. One of the simplest and, to me, most profound ways of viewing the first two commandments of the Ten Commandments comes from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. And Lawrence Kushner reduces them to four words: I'm God, you're not. And his elaboration on that is, he says, I increasingly believe that the existence of those first two commandments is to keep our egos in check. As long as we know that we are not God, we have to show some humility and some modesty in the way we go about living in the world. And that in itself may be a pragmatic way of saying there's a value in believing in God, if only to say we know that we aren't God. Which also may go back to that comment about, could we get rid of the term? Maybe as a term, it serves some purpose, because we can distinguish ourselves from that other that we understand as the ultimate other, perhaps, or we understand as something we have no knowledge of and we're not even sure exists. But one thing we know for certain: we are not it.
And I think there's a reason to be found there for why it was that ancient Israelite tradition and then passed down into Judaism, for not saying the name, not actually giving God a name. I mean, the name of God as it appears in the Torah, or one of the names of God, is simply unpronounceable. We don't know what it is. We don't really know what it means. All we know is that it contains in it the name Yud Hey Vav Hey contains in it the idea that everything that ever was, everything Haya, everything that is Hoveh, and everything that ever will be Yihye. So those three manifestations, those three variations of the verb to be, are contained in that one unpronounceable name of God, which we tend to translate these days as the Eternal One, which is still limits it by putting a name on it, but is certainly much more accessible, shall we say, as well as being avoidable in the way that Richard's just suggested, than God, which is a word that is so loaded and so difficult really to get a proper understanding of, because it's so quickly misconstrued and everybody has their own impressions of it.
The point that you've just written into chat, Janet, which I love, and I agree with you. The challenge arises of coming to synagogue for prayer services. And you continue, perhaps we need to develop more options, as Quakers do, for meditation and exploration rather than liturgy. And I know Howard Cooper offers this every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and a large number of members of This Is Finchley Reform Synagogue choose to attend his parallel sessions. And similarly, if I've offered, or we have offered in my synagogue, a reflective or a meditative type of approach on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, there are certainly numbers in our community who like that as well. And we can move into other forms of reflection and meditation that allow for that grounding within our synagogue communities. Our theology should certainly not be so restrictive that it becomes a set of handcuffs around the freedom of movement of the movement and its congregations. But our theology might say this is the, if you like, the binding overview of the movement. But within that, there's a lot of permission for people to do what allows people to find themselves. The purpose of prayer is for us to rise as better people. If that is achieved by something which you may give under the title of meditation or you may give under the title of something else. The question is, do we rise a better person who goes and does better things following that period of time spent in that setting, doing that work or non-work if it's on Shabbat, can all be helpful.
Well, I mean, let's come back to dear Mrs. Cohen sitting at the back of the shul, praying to be able to win the lottery, which is, I think, we would all agree, falls into the category of making a request of the God we don't believe in. But I always found it quite interesting that when God says, "Do me a favor, Mrs. Cohen, at least buy a ticket," what does buying a ticket actually mean in a theological context, in a synagogue and a prayer context? I mean, as Richard has just said, the whole purpose, not the whole purpose, but one of the key elements of prayer, the origin of prayer, of course, the root of the word prayer in Hebrew is palel, from tefillah. And tefillah, it actually means to examine oneself. So it isn't a case of throwing questions or demands or whatever out into the void, hoping that some divine figure will be listening and will respond. It's actually a bit of introspection, which is what we've got away from. I mean, one of the beauties of progressive liturgy is that it does provide, I think, particularly on High Holy Days, but also on regular Shabbat services as well, is a lot of passages that encourage reflection. They're not prayers, they're simply passages to encourage you to think and to reflect. And we need, I think, to introduce more of that kind of opportunity into our services to enable people to, as Richard has said, to rise from their prayer as a better person. If nobody's going to say anything, I'm going to tell my story. It's my favorite story. You probably know this story anyway. It's a great story. One of the elements of how a new theology perhaps ought to contain is the idea of God being a verb, of God being a manifestation of what we do and how we treat other people, rather than just something to which we address impossible questions or unreasonable demands. And it's the story of a man who is a devout believer and prays a lot. And anyway, his village is suddenly threatened by a massive flood. It's near the coast, and the tide is coming in, and there's a massive flood. And he's in his house, and the water is already flowing quite deeply up his street. And a fire engine comes past the door with its siren going, and they're picking up people in the house from the houses and taking them to a higher ground, to a safe place. And they knock at his door and they say, "Look, come on, mate, you've got to come out. The rain is falling. It's going to keep falling. The water's coming. If you don't come out now, you're going to drown." And the man says, "No, I don't need to come. I don't need your help. I am a believer in God. I pray to God every day, and I know that God will save me. So thank you very much, but I don't need your fire engine." So off the fire engine goes. The water gets higher. He has to go upstairs now because the water's got so high. He's in his bedroom. He's looking out the window, and a lifeboat comes past. And the lifeboat comes past, and they say, "Look, mate, you can see what the water's like. Get out the window, get into the lifeboat, because you are about to drown. If you stay there, you won't live." "No, no," he says, "I believe in God. I've said my prayers. I'm sure that God will save me. I'm really not worried about this. I don't need your lifeboat. Thank you very much." So the lifeboat goes away and goes to see if there's any other people to rescue. Even later, he's up on the roof now because the water's so high that he's about to go. Yes, it's a good story. I know people have heard it. I'm sorry if you haven't already heard it. And while he's up on the roof, a helicopter flies overhead. They drop a rope ladder down and they shout out to him, say, "Come on, get on the ladder. This is your last chance. If you don't get on this ladder, you are going to drown." And the guy gives his usual shtick, his usual spiel. "No, I believe in God. God's going to save me. I don't need to worry about this." And so the helicopter goes away and he's left on the roof and he drowns. And he goes up to heaven, according to this story. And he gets in to see God, who, needless to say, is an old man with a beard sitting on a chair looking down. And he says to God, "What's that about? I pray to you every day. I believe in you. I think you know, and I thought you were going to save me. And you let me drown. What's the story?" And God says, "Look," he said, "I sent you a fire engine and a lifeboat and a helicopter. What else did you want me to do?" And I think the point about that is that it reminds us and gets us to realize that God is manifested through the way that we behave, through the actions that we do, through the use that we make of the resources in our society to make the world a better place or to save people in this particular context. And I think that's quite, although it's a very twee little story, I think it gives an interesting idea of how we ought to understand how God works.
And so the theology that we hope and expect to be creating together with all those who are interested in developing it, because I'm sure one of the things that we will be doing is taking theological ideas out to have sessions in as many communities as want them is to explore how we word this sort of partnership, and also what sort of concepts we need to establish. But I think one of them that is going to be central is that whether you use Alex Wright's wording of made that the society will be made whole through the vision and action of humanity in partnership with God, whether you follow the ideas that we've been developing of rigorous kindness, applying to the approach that we have, whether we go back to ethical monotheism and elaborate on that, or whether we really look at how in the 21st century we need a new Haskalah, a new enlightenment to allow our thinking to flourish, that we can consider all these things and develop something that we feel will enable us to do the best for ourselves, each other, our communities, and the society around us, so that progressive Judaism in the United Kingdom is genuinely benefiting the United Kingdom and all the people within it, as well as us and our communities and ourselves.